This is the second part of the trigeminal ganglion video. We will examine the ganglion and related structures through dissections of transverse sections. Here we can identify the ventral petrosal sinus in the petrobasilar canal, blue arrow, and the root of the trigeminal nerve, yellow arrow. As we progress rostrally, we identify the trigeminal ganglion, yellow arrow, in the trigeminal canal, and the ventral petrosal sinus, blue arrow. At the level of the metathalamus, the trigeminal ganglion, yellow arrow, is exiting the rostral opening of the trigeminal canal. In a dissection of a transverse section at the level of the dorsum sellae, black asterisk, we can identify the cavernous sinuses on each side, red asterisk. After removing the venous blood of the cavernous sinus, we identify the internal carotid artery, the abducent cranial nerve, and the trigeminal ganglion. On the contralateral side, we identify the cavernous sinus, blue asterisk, the trigeminal ganglion, red arrow, after exiting the trigeminal canal, and the mandibular nerve, red asterisk, living through the oval foramen. Notice the venous plexus that contacts the ventromedial aspect of the mandibular nerve and the dorsolateral aspect of the rostral portion of the trigeminal ganglion. After removing the blood from the cavernous sinus, it is easy to see the internal carotid artery, red arrow, the caudal intercarotid artery, dotted red arrow, that is going to join its counterpart and give rise to the caudal hypophyseal artery, the abducent cranial nerve, yellow triangle, the anastomotic ramus between the internal carotid artery and the external ophthalmic artery, orange arrow, and the numerous communications between the arteries and the abducent nerve, yellow arrows, formed by sympathetic nerve fibers and vasa nervorum. The trigeminal ganglion. This is the internal carotid artery with the caudal intercarotid artery. The abducent cranial nerve. And the communicating ramus. Look at the connective tissue, dura mater, that separates the cavernous sinus from the trigeminal ganglion. And the connective tissue, inner dura mater, forming the ventral wall of the cavernous sinus. Again, we identify the intercarotid artery branching off from the internal carotid artery, this one, and the dorsal wall of the cavernous sinus formed by connective tissue of the inner dura mater, and the numerous connections between the abducent cranial nerve and the arteries that are sympathetic fibers and vasa nervorum. Now we have opened dorsally both cavernous sinuses up to the beginning of the ventral petrosal sinuses, and we clearly identify the internal carotid arteries on both sides. This is a very nice view where we can clearly appreciate the postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers running with the internal carotid artery. Now we are at the level of the interthalamic adhesion, where we clearly identify the rostral portion of the dorsum cellae, red arrow, the hypophysis, red triangle, the rostral portion of the trigeminal ganglion, yellow arrow, and the maxillary nerve, orange arrows. Rostral to the interthalamic adhesion, we identify the maxillary artery, red arrow, in the alar canal, and the ophthalmic nerve, orange arrow, on the lateral aspect of the cavernous sinus. In a dissection of the transverse section at the level of the hypophysis, we have removed the venous blood from one of the cavernous sinuses. This is a dorsal view of the floor of the cranial cavity. The oculomotor nerve is marked with a red arrow and the abducent nerve with a green arrow. Going back to the previous image, we identify the internal carotid artery, red arrow, the anastomotic ramus, dotted red arrow, the abducent cranial nerve, yellow arrow, the ophthalmic nerve, dotted yellow arrow, and the diaphragma cellae, blue arrow, formed by a thickening of the inner and outer layers of the dura mater. Now we are at the level of the alar canal, and we identify the maxillary artery surrounded by a venous plexus. The maxillary nerve and the nerve of the pterygoid canal, formed by postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers, ovidian nerve, and facial preganglionic nerve fibers. The trochlear nerve, the ophthalmic nerve, and the abducent nerve, red arrow. And now in this image we see the neurohypophysis, red asterisk, the adenohypophysis, green asterisk. Inside the cavernous sinus, blue triangle, we identify the internal carotid artery, red arrow, the anastomotic ramus, dotted red arrow, and ventrolaterally the alar canal with the maxillary nerve, yellow asterisk, and the maxillary artery, blue arrow. This is the maxillary artery, surrounded by a venous plexus. The maxillary nerve and the nerve of the pterygoid canal. The maxillary artery, surrounded by a venous plexus. In the same section, but on the contralateral side, the nerves oculomotor, 3rd, abducent, 6th, ophthalmic, 5th, trochlear, 4th, and maxillary, 5th, are marked. This drawing represents a dorsal view of the right cavernous sinus and the abducent, trochlear, oculomotor, and ophthalmic cranial nerves. Notice how the abducent, 6th, cranial nerve is surrounded by arachnoid before it enters the cavernous sinus. So the subarachnoid space surrounds the nerve between its exit from the brain stem and the cavernous sinus. Notice as well that the oculomotor nerve, 3rd cranial nerve, is surrounded by arachnoid inside the dura mater. This cavity of subarachnoid space, filled with CSF, is the oculomotor cistern. This drawing represents a posterior view of a transverse section of the right cavernous sinus. Notice that the oculomotor nerve, third cranial nerve, is surrounded by the arachnoid, forming the oculomotor cistern around it. The abducens nerve is located inside the cavernous sinus, and the trochlear and ophthalmic nerves are surrounded by duramata on the lateral aspect of the cavernous sinus. This is the maxillary artery inside the alar canal, surrounded by a venous plexus. This transverse section at the level of the hypophysis is made just at the level of the round foramen, red arrows, where the maxillary nerve, yellow asterisk, enters the alar canal. This is the ophthalmic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, the anastomotic ramus, located in close contact with the abducens cranial nerve. This one. The internal carotid artery. The inner layer of the duramata that forms the ventromedial wall of the cavernous sinus, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. On the contralateral side, the hypophysis, the internal carotid artery, the oculomotor nerve, the abducens nerve, the ophthalmic nerve, the trochlear nerve, the maxillary nerve, the maxillary artery, with the venous plexus surrounding it, and the nerve of the pterygoid canal, red arrow. Now we move to the level of the optic chiasm, yellow arrow, and the orbital fissure, red arrow. The transverse section shows the optic chiasm, black asterisk, and ventrolaterally the orbital fissure. Inside the orbital fissure we find the anastomotic ramus with the external ophthalmic artery, this one, and the oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, and ophthalmic nerves, and the origin of the cavernous sinus. The rostral cerebral artery is localized on both sides of the optic chiasm. Here you have the rostral aspect of the optic chiasm with the rostral cerebral arteries. Rostral to the optic chiasm, the internal ethmoidal artery is marked with a red arrow.